Welcome to Question Time, where people can ask questions directly to those in power and those who want to be in power. Tonight we're in the unofficial second city of the UK. We're in Birmingham, a former industrial heartland, given an impressive makeover for the Commonwealth Games here last summer. We have a thoughtful panel, an audience raring to go with a lively debate on the NHS, widespread strikes, do we take maths seriously enough, and a certain angry prince in exile. Welcome to Question Time. From the government, Alex Chalk, who's currently Minister of State of the MOD. He gave up his career in the law when he was elected MP for Cheltenham in 2015. Prior to his current government job in defence, he worked in education and justice. One of the Labour Party's rising talents is Bridget Phillipson, having been elected at the age of just 26. She's now in her 14th year in the Commons, and having previously spoken for her party on Treasury matters, she's now Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Anna Soubry's colourful parliamentary adventure began as Conservative MP for Broxtowe in 2010. It ended in 2019 after she quit the Tories to join the short-lived centrist party Change UK, who opposed leaving the EU. She's since returned to her initial career as a criminal barrister. The lecturer, journalist and polemicist Ash Sarkar is a contributing editor at the left-wing website Novara Media. She was a big supporter of the former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn in the run-up to the 2019 election. And Tim Stanley is a historian, author and broadcaster. He's a leader writer at the Daily Telegraph and, along with Ash, is a regular panellist on Radio 4's Moral Maze. His latest book, Whatever Happened to Tradition, says progress is only possible if we respect the past. Welcome to Question Time. This is our first of 2023. Welcome to our panellists. Welcome to all of you here in Birmingham. Great to see you. And, of course, welcome to you at home. We'll have a lively debate here. Of course, there's a lively debate on social media as well. So do join in. The address will be on the screen. You can take part in the conversation that way. Enjoy the programme. Let's have our first question tonight, which is from Navreen Fagura.
With a record 50,000 patients a week experiencing over 12-hour A&E waits, when will the Prime Minister finally admit the NHS is in crisis?
So, Navreen, you're asking this question. What is your experience with the NHS? Why are you asking it?
Well, I'm a junior doctor, so I'm working in the NHS. I worked on the front line, and you just see the problems. Patients can't move from A&E into beds on the wards. Patients are just there. Especially elderly patients who need social care, they just can't be discharged. They're there for days and if not weeks. And you've just got really sick patients in ambulances that just can't move through the system. And just like recently, my own nan spent 48 hours in a trolley in ED before she could move to a ward. So I experienced it through work and through my own family. And it's just in crisis. And I just think there's been like a decade of underfunding and a workforce crisis that has not been addressed. And this is why, I think the NHS is pretty much at breaking point.
So, Alex, Navreen is a junior doctor, is using the word crisis. The Prime Minister conspicuously is not using the word crisis. Yeah. Is he wrong to do so?
Well, I think the Prime Minister is absolutely clear, and he's said this, that the NHS is under extreme pressure, and he's not balked about that at all.
But why would the word crisis is many people have asked him to try and get him to say it, and he's not saying. Is that because he doesn't think it is?
No, look, I think he recognises this is immensely serious, and certainly when he did his speech recently at the beginning of the year, he named getting down the waiting list as one of his absolute priorities. And of course, last weekend, as you know, he was there meeting with the NHS. The pressures are absolutely extraordinary. I think we know that. But what he's been absolutely clear about as one of his targets, he wants to get the waiting list down to, they were at 2 years, not least because of the backlog from COVID, get them under 2 years to 18 months maximum by this spring, and then by next spring down to 12 months. And what he said, and I think this is really refreshing, is he said, look, here I stand, this is the target, this is what I want to be judged on, and if I don't, you please do judge me. And I think that's absolutely the right approach. So he's been clear, yes, this is an intense issue, but he's got a plan to deal with it.
Okay. Navreen, you asked the question, does it matter to you whether or not the Prime Minister uses the word crisis or not?
I think it does, because if you acknowledge there's a crisis, then you know there's a problem to fix. But when you're not just skirting around the issue, you don't really do anything properly to change it. And by just saying we're investing loads of money this year, if you look, the own Department of Health funded a report which showed by the King's Health Fund, which showed there's been a decade of underfunding and not addressing the issues, which is why we're in this problem. It's not just the COVID backlog, it's been going on for years, and we don't have the staff or the beds or the facilities to actually fix this. What Rishi Sunak says just will not happen. We just don't have the staff or the beds. And there's no point saying we've got loads of new people coming in if the current nurses and doctors are leaving. And we have the lowest number of doctors per thousand in the population for OECD countries. So there is just a problem that they're just not addressing properly.
Well, certainly demand is colossal, and it's not just because of the pandemic, although the pandemic did have a very significant impact, not least because people weren't being referred, people got sicker because elective care didn't happen, which is why he wants to continue with elective care. But on the specific capacity, since 2010, there are 34,000 more doctors and 44,000 more nurses. Now, I absolutely accept that we need to go further, and he is going further. And indeed, I think since 2019, I think there have been an additional 4,000 doctors, and there are 72,000 nurses and midwives currently being trained. But what we have got to do is to ensure that we don't make, as it were, don't make the mistakes of simply saying, right, we're just going to focus on urgent and emergency care. We've got to get through that elective care, because if we don't, those people will become sicker. And that's what, last thing is that, I know you say it's not all about money, but even at a time like this when finances are stretched, he found an additional £14 billion to ensure that the NHS has got really resources going into the coming years. Anna?
Just say, obviously, because you were a former government minister for public health.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you convinced by that? You're shaking your head.
How the hell can we sort this problem out in an honest and effective way if we can't even admit that there is a crisis, and it's the biggest crisis in the NHS's history? And until we have a government that actually accepts that, we're not going to make progress. Look, there are certain things that this government should be doing absolutely now. The first thing is to sort out the nurses' pay claim, the other pay claims, and it's up to the government to do it, and it can do it, and it should do it. You're a junior doctor. I'm a trustee of a little charity called Doctors in Distress. And we know, as you know, the reality, lots of you know, the reality of what's happening in our NHS. We have people on the front line who go into medicine because they care passionately to help people get better, or if they can't make them better, to ease their pain and discomfort. These people are burnt out, they are at their wits' end, and they are leaving because they are racked with guilt and shame that they can't deliver the service that they want to deliver and we expect. So sort out the staffing, increase the morale, therefore, of our workforce, and let them get on and treat patients. Let's bring back all those EU workers and fill some of the gaps in our staffing levels. And because one in 8 posts is unfilled. It's a crisis. And the third thing which this government must do is make now the changes to social care. 1 in 8 beds is blocked by somebody who can't go into a care home. And Alex, I was in a government that knocked it into the long grass. Other subsequent governments has done it. Your government is now doing it again, and it's not good enough. If it means I have to pay more tax, I'll pay more tax to give us an NHS which is doing the job we all want it to do.
There are a lot of hands up. The lady there in the yellow dress, I saw that you were nodding along to that.
I'm also a junior doctor, and I live and work in Anna's old constituency. And I work on a dementia specialist ward, and I've had patients who are medically fit, who do not need to be in an acute hospital bed waiting for placements for months now, because there's 165,000 vacancies in social care and you haven't addressed it. Last year, 7,000 doctors approached our regulator looking for permission and their paperwork to go and work abroad. You only train 8,000 medical students a year. Retention is in crisis in the NHS. You must address it. You must address it. And my trust declared a critical incident, and it stepped down the critical incident not because things are getting better, but because it doesn't make any difference us declaring a critical incident, because you refuse to accept that this is a crisis and people are dying because you are not addressing the problems.
Okay. A woman here in front in the pink dress.
So I'm an emergency nurse practitioner. I've only been qualified actually for 4 years.
Oh my goodness, it feels like our audience is full of people. I know it isn't, but I seem to have unerringly seem to have found you. Yes.
I've only actually been qualified for 4 years. I've been on the front line prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, post-pandemic. I'm going to put this bluntly. It's like a war zone. There's beds everywhere. There's patients everywhere. There's elderly people. People are sitting on chairs for 24 hours. It's not okay no more. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed now. Like in 2019, there was a manifesto pledge that there was going to build 40 new hospitals. That hasn't even been done remotely, even looked into. Where are they finding the staff to even staff those? Because they can't retain the staff they've got because they don't know how to look after them. All we get told is we're not skilled enough, we need to justify a pay rise, and I think we've justified it enough. We're tired and we've had enough.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to come around the rest of the panel. I just want to give you one last chance, Alex. Do you want to admit the NHS is in crisis?
Well,
if the Prime Minister doesn't, do you, hearing this, do you want to?
There is no doubt that the pressures are at historic
and you said
levels.
that. Do you want to say
The reason why
crisis?
I say that is because, you know, talk is cheap, action is what matters. And
I'm not asking what you're asking. You've made clear already about the money.
Yes or no?
Yes, well, that's what I'm asking you.
It's incredibly intense, and the pressures are...
Okay, so you don't want to use that word. I think we've got that. You clearly don't want to use that word.
No, but it's the actions that matter.
I know we've heard that. I'm just asking about the word.
There's a crisis. Listen to people.
And
They're on the front line.
Bridget.
It's clear that the NHS is in crisis and it's facing the greatest crisis in its history. And those of you working in the NHS see it every day. But what everyone who uses the NHS and needs the NHS every day, they also see that. Because if you look at how long people have to wait, you know, stroke victims, heart attack victims, an hour and a half when every second counts, sometimes more than 3 hours in order for an ambulance to arrive. And, you know, we're in the ludicrous position at the moment where Conservative ministers are talking about introducing minimum standards during strikes. You can't guarantee on a normal day that you will get an ambulance when you need it, and that is terrifying. It is terrifying for everybody that the NHS is not there for us when we need it.
So
and
what does Labour think the answer is?
Absolutely. So
I'm not suggesting it's simple, but what do you think the answer is?
It's far from simple because, you know, the next Labour government will inherit an NHS that has had 13 years of Conservative mismanagement and underinvestment. So it will take time to put it right. It took time after 1990. It took time after 1997. And we fixed it and we transformed the NHS and we will do it again. And that will come down to workforce. We need more doctors, we need more nurses, we need to change the way that the NHS works. And that's why we've set out the most ambitious plan for a generation around recruiting that next generation of doctors and nurses so that those colleagues already working in the NHS have got that extra backup, because we are losing people in their droves because the pressure is just enormous. You know, when I speak to people locally working in the NHS as well, nobody goes into public service or goes to work in the NHS to come home feeling that they've let people down or that they're burnt out or that they can't cope. And that's why people leave. And under
to
Labour,
recruit all these extra people, will you expect people to pay more taxes to pay for that?
So we would fund that by ending the non-dom tax status. So people that are the wealthiest in our society.
That's not going to cover it all, though.
It will absolutely. No, it does. It does cover it all. The plan that we've set out, a fully funded, fully costed plan to end the non-dom tax status. The current Chancellor, when he was chair of the Health Select Committee, said it was a great idea. I would love it if your government adopted Labour's plan and got on and did it, because people can't wait.
All right, Tim.
I think the best chance you've got of seeing a doctor nowadays on the NHS is to go on Question Time, because...
It's only beginning to feel that way.
I think the government is reluctant to use the crisis word for two reasons. One, because it doesn't want to panic people, so that people will stop trying to stop using the service if they think that it's completely broken down. So I think there's a rational thinking behind it. The other reason is they want the idea to percolate that there are things beyond the government's control that are responsible for this, notably COVID and lockdown and flu. The problem with that argument is that the service was in a poor shape before COVID and the lockdown. And it was in a poor shape in particular because of a failure to reform certain things, like the way that GPs work, because of a failure to invest in social care, which is why you've got horrible term bed blocking on the NHS, and also because of a failure to invest. Now, it is true, the government will immediately say, but we have recruited more staff, we have spent more money in real terms. That's true. But the thing about health spending is it has to increase year on year well above inflation for it to keep pace with growing need, and particularly with an elderly population and changing technology. So the problem is that the government can say, here's the figure we put in. It's not enough year by year to meet the demands of a rising population. So the solution is either a significant increase in tax, and taxes have already gone up, or some other kind of root and branch reform, which I'm wondering if people are starting to think might be possible. I was very interested that Wes Streeting, the Labour Shadow Health Secretary, has said that they'll use more private beds. Well, what about using more private medicine? I mean, when it comes to, for example, in Australia, higher rate taxpayers are effectively obliged to buy private insurance, and there's been a large increase in people doing that. Now, from all my years of going on Question Time, I know that the two most unpopular things to support are incest and private medicine. But nonetheless, I think we're reaching a point where people can see that this current structure does not meet the needs of an ageing and growing population. And perhaps we need a royal commission. We need some kind of broad, honest discussion about what we can afford, what's not working, and we've got to fix it in the long term. Short-term cash injection, long-term structural reform.
Ash, I'll come to you in a minute. I'm just going to go around the audience a bit more. Yes, woman here in the glasses.
I worked in the NHS for 8 years as a registered nurse, and I left nearly 12 years ago because of disability after attacked by a care work assistant, support worker, for no reason. It was just racially motivated. In the NHS, there is violence from workers to workers, not from patients to workers. There's violence, there's bullying, there's racism, there's discrimination. And people are moving out of the NHS, not because they don't want to work in the NHS, but it's toxic. It's so toxic in the NHS. I was attacked first time 2003 by a ward sister. And then I was attacked 2011 by a support worker. Now I'm disabled, I can't work, I'm disabled for life. I'm on benefits. My life is destroyed.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
My life is destroyed. And all what the hospital wants, instead of tackling the situation, because they've got all the opportunities, when things like this happens, they've got the opportunity to make things right. But what they do is they take everything, move everything, sweep everything under the carpet. And that continues and continues and continues.
Well, look, I'm so sorry to, and thank you for sharing. Thank you is the right word, but thank you for sharing your experience with it. I'm very, very sorry to hear about it. I'll take a few more points from the rest of the audience. The man here in the blue shirt.
I'm currently a junior doctor as well. I'm working as a teaching fellow in one of the hospitals nearby.
Can I just, everyone put their hands down. How many NHS workers are in this audience? Put your hands up. Right, well, I just seem to have found you all somewhere. But anyway, yes, OK, put your hands back up if you want to say something. Yes, man in the blue shirt.
I think much of the underfunding and the pressures and strain that's currently going on is having quite a large impact as well on the repercussions of undergraduate education. I'm obviously teaching and educating the next generation of medical students where they are now actually struggling to get the opportunities they require to be trained appropriately. And actually it's making a lot of them put off having to work in the NHS going forward. So I suspect that actually this will have a large impact on vacancies going forward, and much of my students come to me anyway as a result, asking what other opportunities they have to be looking outside of the NHS.
Gosh, even after going through all that training. The man here in the front in the blue sweater. Yes.
Yeah, almost every week on Question Time, the government representative says, we've been hiring all of these people, we're increasing this number, we're increasing that number. But that is completely irrelevant if the people there are leaving. If you're only filling the people that are leaving, it's not improving the situation.
I mean, there are actually, despite how it feels to so many of us, there are actually more doctors and more nurses now than there were, let's say, in 2019, despite the numbers of people leaving.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I've been in and out of hospitals in the Birmingham area for the last 2.5 years for various different conditions, and the last time was in August. And I was in Solihull Hospital on a ward with 27 patients, and there were 2 nurses on the night shift, a man and a woman. Both of them got attacked by other patients during the night, and I ended up helping them because they just couldn't cope. And the female nurse in the morning said to me, I don't think I'm coming back tonight. I can't take it anymore. And if people are leaving in droves, you can hire as many as you want. It's not going to fix the problem. What you've got to do is keep the staff we've got.
Ash, we haven't heard from you yet. I mean, the question is, when will the Prime Minister admit the NHS is in crisis?
Well, look, the reason why you don't want to admit that it's a crisis is because it makes your government look bad, and it's that simple. But if you can't be trusted to describe the problem, why should we trust you to fix the problem? It's wholly deceptive. There's a lot that's been said tonight that I obviously agree with. You need more staff in the NHS, you need to grow capacity, you need that capacity to keep up with the fact that we've got a growing and an ageing population. But there's one thing which I think we really need to talk about, and that is how you keep staff, the staff that you've got. Between 2010 and 2020, the real terms pay of doctors on average fell by around 25%. That is a huge devaluing of doctors' work. Do you think that doctors' work became 25% less useful during that time? No. You just decided to start paying them worse comparative to what they'd been paid before and forcing them to work in worse conditions. And when it came to your party's mates in the city, you said, well, in order to get the best talent, we've got to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. Right. Pay's got to be competitive. But when it comes to things like the NHS or the education sector, you're effectively saying to all these public sector workers, get poorer and be happy about it. Now, why should any of them accept that?
That's not right.
Unless you're giving them a pay rise which keeps up with inflation, they are getting poorer.
So look, the position is, the way it's worked, and by the way, not just under the Conservative government, but under previous governments, is that these decisions, you try to take the politics out of it, because there is a lot of politics in this, of course, so that the pay review bodies have a look at it. And just to put that in some kind of context, in a previous dispute in the 1980s, it was actually the nursing union at that stage which called for this to be done by the pay review body. And I mean,
I'm sorry, if you're going back to the 1980s, it's such a weird argument. We're talking about what's going on in 2023. The fact is that you've got nurses using food banks, doctors moving to Australia where the pay is better, and that's because your pay isn't competitive.
But can I just explain how it works? Only because when I was the Prisons Minister, I actually made representations to the pay review body. So you have people who are highly expert people, qualified. Sometimes they might have a trade union background, sometimes they might have other area of expertise. The government and the minister will give evidence about what is affordable. They can take expert evidence from elsewhere, and they will then reach a decision. And by the way,
the pay review body is making decisions based on what funding you allocate. I'm sorry, this is such a ridiculous way of you to try and shunt off responsibility.
Can I just quickly finish?
Sorry, darling, it's just that this is a phony argument.
No, but I haven't made it yet. Can I just quickly finish that? Can I just finish the line?
Talking about pay reviews.
All right, go on. Let him get a word in fairness, and then you can come back.
Okay, so what happens is the government does submit evidence about what is affordable. Now, in this case, the pay review body came back and said, we're very interested, fascinated to hear your argument, but actually, we are going to make a settlement which is more than the government said was affordable. So now the government could turn around and say, well, look, we still can't afford it. But the government in this case said, OK, we will accept it. Every last penny that the independent pay review body asked for. And the point is this, is anyone here suggesting we should get rid of the independent pay review body?
No, you're missing the point.
No, but if you accept it...
14 health unions have said they're not going to cooperate with independent pay review, so yes, they are.
This is a
but the question is, are the politicians saying...
It's a phony argument?
Sorry, I've said my bit.
Because you can say you've got the pay review boards that say it's going to be 5%, 10%. The reality is, and if you're a proper Tory who believes in the market is telling you we have vacancies we cannot fill. So you say, well, why have we got those those vacancies that we cannot fill, notwithstanding your pay review board. And it's a combination, yes, of pay, but it's also the conditions. And as everybody else on this panel and in this audience has said, people are voting with their feet. They're burnt out, they're fed up. That is the problem.
When you were a minister, you dealt with pay review bodies.
No, I didn't.
So why didn't you say something about them then?
Because you're missing the point. You can talk about pay review bodies. You're missing the point, which is the market is telling you, Alex, it doesn't matter about your pay review bodies.
Alex,
they're walking away. 160,000 vacancies in social care, 1 in 8 unfilled jobs in our NHS. It doesn't matter about your pay review bodies.
The trouble is, this misrepresents the work of the peer review bodies. The position that you've set out, ministers make representations. Yes, absolutely, they do that. But they also give a steer to the peer review bodies about how they're to consider these matters. So, for example, government ministers could say to the peer review body, you must take account of recruitment and retention issues when considering the settlement that they put forward. If ministers were to do that, I think you would get a very different outcome from the peer review bodies. So to simply hide behind the peer review bodies and say it's nothing to do with us, it's not the responsibility of government. Look, people expect that the government take responsibility for the NHS, not hiding behind others. And this will not be solved until ministers take some responsibility.
They agree with PRBs. Would you scrap the PRBs?
This is a ludicrous line. Of course we would not. This is a ludicrous line of
I tell you what, let's not go too far down the rabbit hole of peer review. Not that it's not important, and it is critical to what's going on. I totally get that. But I feel we're going to spend the next half hour talking about peer review bodies if we're not careful. And there's a lot of hands up want to talk about the NHS, and also a lot of you put in questions about other things. I just want to tell you what we're doing next week, which will explain why I'm not going to take more questions from you now. Because next week, we're in Hoddesdon, just north of London, Hertfordshire, and we are doing a special edition of Question Time all about healthcare. All about what's happening in the NHS, in social care, what's happening to mental health care. That's what the whole programme is going to be about. So I'm going to cut the conversation short just for now. If you want to go to our website and be part of our audience, please do. We'd love to see you. I feel I almost don't need to say that because it's quite clear that we do get a lot of people coming from the NHS anyway. But obviously, if you work for the NHS or in social care, or you use it, you are affected by it, we particularly like to have you in the audience as well. So it'll be the whole programme, barring some big political cataclysm, which we also have to discuss. But otherwise, we're intending to spend the whole programme talking about what is happening in our healthcare. So that's next week in Hoddesdon. Go to our website. We'd love to have you there. OK, so I'm going to move on for now, important though this is, and go to Jim Goldstraw.
Is the right to strike a basic right of an employee, and should it be protected?
Right. OK. So, Jim, of course, what you're talking about is minimum service levels, which is something that the government wants to introduce, which basically means some of the workforce could strike, but there'd have to be a minimum service, and the government is looking at areas such as health, transport, education, border security, nuclear decommissioning. I mean, it goes across all sorts of sectors. Bridget.
Yes, absolutely. The right to strike is an important fundamental principle in our democracy and the hallmark of a free and open society. If you end up having strikes, and sadly we are seeing industrial action right across a range of different areas of the public and private sectors, that's a symptom of failure. It represents a failure to arrive at a solution that everyone can live with. And I think we've seen tonight part of the reason why we're ending up with strikes, whether it's in our NHS or why we're seeing ballots taking place, for example, in our schools, because government ministers pretend that somehow this is nothing to do with them. You know, ministers should get around the table, whether that's the industrial action that we're likely to face in our schools or the industrial action that we're seeing in our NHS, get around the table and sort it out. The last thing that we need is further legislation in this area. You can't legislate your way out of an industrial action. You can't prevent it in that way. It is a total distraction from the big fundamental challenges that we face as a country.
And do you think there's any role at all, given that other countries do have it in to various degrees in different shapes and forms, for any role for minimum service?
I would love to see minimum services in the NHS right now.
No, I get that, you made that.
We don't have
but
that.
Across other areas as well, such as transport, for example.
Well, the Transport Secretary actually said he doesn't think the legislation is going to work in the transport sector. And the Education Secretary said she doesn't want it in education. So I don't think it's going to work, and I don't think it's the answer. And in those countries that do have it, you've seen increased industrial action and you've seen legal challenge. if ministers spent a little bit more time seeking to try and find a way through it and to get a settlement, rather than engaging in this kind of distraction activity around legislation, then we'd be in a much stronger position where it comes to the NHS and our schools.
Alex.
Well, I respectfully but fundamentally disagree. So it's not just the British government saying that this is a reasonable thing to do. The International Labour Organization says it's a reasonable thing to do. And as has been indicated, this is something that applies in France, in Italy, in Spain. Now,
but when you mention the International Labour Organization, they say, as you're right, because I looked into this, because this was something that the Prime Minister mentioned yesterday, but they say minimum service levels are, a proportionate way of balancing the right to strike, but only to cover safety of individuals and their health. So that would not include a lot of things that the government is suggesting, such as education, for example.
Well, I mean,
I just think if you're going to quote them, you might as well quote the whole thing.
No, that's absolutely right. But what I wanted to say is that we already have in our country, there are certain sectors that can't strike. So the police is an obvious one. But if you go to other countries, namely United States and Canada, if you work in the health sector, you can't strike at all. Now, we're not saying you can't strike at all, because as the point the gentleman was making, of course, you have to be able to strike that balance. However, when it comes to issue of life and limb, if you or someone you love, your friend, your mother, your sister, if you don't know that someone will come when there's literally a risk to life, I don't think that's the right balance.
That's a normal day at the moment.
But the NHS...
Well, we can talk about the plan on these specifics, but I'm just saying that we have to get to a point where there's a risk to life and limb that people should be able to... And can I just make this one last point?
You will have seen paramedics... You will have seen people leaving picket lines during strikes to respond to precisely those calls.
Absolutely, but can I deal with that specific point? So one of the things that was very responsible, if I, again, may respectfully say so, is the nursing union said in advance, this is what we will provide along the lines that you indicated. But there were other sectors which didn't. And so you had a perverse situation where literally 2 minutes to midnight, not metaphorically, literally, the Secretary of State was finding out what ambulance cover was going to be provided the following day. So all this is saying is that we should be able to know in advance, so you haven't got regional discrepancies where an ambulance will come in these circumstances in the northwest but not in the southeast, but so that you can see transparently and in advance what are those minimum levels.
It's not just about health, of course.
The nurses said, but ahead of Christmas, the nursing union said, if ministers sit down and talk to us about pay, we'll call off the strikes. Why didn't they do it?
But that's a separate... We are absolutely
not a separate issue. It's at the heart of the issue.
But the question, in fairness, the question is about the right to strike a basic right of employee, and it's not just about health. And I know you keep bringing it back to that, but it's about I'm quoting the government here: border security, nuclear decommissioning, education. Let's hear from some other. The woman with the glasses there in the middle. Yes.
More of a comment, really. I absolutely support this right to strike. I think we should do it, and I'd like to invite Alex, the government, and the Tories to strike immediately, because we could absolutely go without your service.
How do you know the difference?
The man in front in the blue jacket.
So I find it ironic that we're talking about a legal strike, because a strike is an act of defiance and really an example of how the government has failed to negotiate and reach a particular settlement on a particular issue. I don't think we need to have a legal strike. If people want to strike and rebel against a government that they feel is oppressing them, it should be their right to do so. And absolutely, I think that by forcing people who don't want to work, that's the beginning of what could be a police state.
Just in the interest of getting, a varied opinion from the audience, is there anyone in the audience who does think that having minimum service legislation is a good idea? Yes, there are a few. So let's hear from you as well, just in the interest of getting a balance of opinion. Yes, the man there with the red hair and the blue polo top. Yeah.
I do think that the thought of one of our family members lying in a desperate state, waiting for an ambulance and it not turning up due to a strike, is something that none of us could imagine. And I think the desperation people would feel. I've waited for an ambulance for a broken arm, and that is not as extreme as someone waiting for a stroke. And I can just imagine someone feeling with a stroke, waiting up on the floor, waiting for one of our heroes. They are heroes, our NHS, coming to save us in our desperate state of need, and that not happening is genuinely to show that the NHS is at breaking point and it needs a solution, and the government needs to get up, make a solution and do it quickly.
OK. And the man behind you with the... Actually, both men have got glasses. Let's hear from both of you. Yes. The guy with the black jumper. Yeah.
So, I agree with right to strike only in the same breath if you actually, in law, set out that these key workers would actually get all the pays related to inflation.
So hang on, when you say you agree with the right to strike, you mean you agree with the idea that there should be minimum strike legislation? Is that
Correct.
what you mean? Yes.
Only if they are getting paid inflation rates. So then they won't need to strike, and you can set your minimum levels.
So what, just have whatever salary you want, but you can't strike? Is that what you're saying?
In a sense, related to inflation.
Right. Okay. Okay. And what about the man in front of you in the glass as well?
All the issues that we've raised all relate down to inflation. So it's inflation that's eroding people's pay, and obviously it's conditions also. The government needs to start tackling inflation first.
Okay. Also, let me just get round the panel bit, and I'll come back to you, Ash.
So, do you know why they're trying to make it harder for people to go on strike? Because it's very simple. This government is scared of what happens when workers organise collectively together. They're scared that after 12 years of stagnant and falling living standards, of not getting pay rises in the good times, now there's a cost of living crisis, you can't get a pay rise now either, that people are realising that the only power they have is collective bargaining, and when being pushed to it, withdrawing their labour. So that's why they're trying to push through this, frankly, pathetic package of measures to try and restrict people's right to exercise that fundamental democratic right. And if people are out there thinking about organising their workplaces, this should give them heart, that the government are on the back foot, and it's pathetic, quite frankly.
Tim.
I agree with you, Ash, the government is scared, but I don't think they're scared of that. I think they're scared of an inflationary spiral of wage demands.
That's exactly it. But hang on, when pay rises are going up in the private sector and they're not going up in the public sector, how can you make the claim that you're scared of a wage price spiral?
Well, this comes back to the question about health versus bankers' bonuses. The point is that wages and bonuses can go up in the private sector because you and I ain't paying for them. But when it comes to a nationalised, publicly owned industry like health, then it's a different matter because of tax.
You said it's a wage price spiral, which is something different. That's
someone on this panel should defend minimum. Right. First of all, they're afraid of an inflationary spiral. Secondly, they're afraid of the government getting involved directly in negotiations, because we can't go back to a situation like the 1960s and 70s where whenever there's a strike at a factory, the government goes in with beer and sandwiches and tries to negotiate an outcome. They don't want that. They want to go back to a corporatist model. And finally, they're frightened, they're scared of services grinding to a halt because of strike action. And for anyone who's, for instance, been grounded for the last few weeks by train strikes, that's a perfectly reasonable concern. The problem with the withdrawal of labour, which is a democratic right, one wants to sustain it, one wants to keep it, of course, is that if a train driver goes on strike and it stops the service from running, that has an effect upon people doing their job. It has an effect upon them being able to access health.
But those train drivers are missing out on their pay too.
And also, for the gentleman in the audience who said this is a step towards a police state, the government's point is it's not, because several liberal democracies have these minimum service level arrangements already in place. And moreover, some of those liberal democracies go even further and ban strikes on frontline work altogether. Now, having said all of that, because one doesn't want to have to do this sort of thing, because one doesn't want to see striking, the government has failed in its first responsibility, which is to make sure that this doesn't arise, that we don't have an inflationary crisis, and that we don't have people feeling they have to go on strike. The public could quite reasonably say, OK, minimum service levels for unions, but why isn't the government required to deliver a minimum service level? Because I don't know about you, when the strikes on the trains first started, my initial reaction was, how could you tell? Because the service was rubbish before the strikes began. It's completely unreliable in my area, and many younger people entering the workforce now see trains in particular no longer as a challenge to navigate, but an obstacle to avoid. And they will start to get jobs and live in areas where they can take the bus or they can drive, and as a result, an industry, through a combination of private greed or government error or the workers going on strike, is going to end up destroying itself. So this all has to be resolved, but I don't like this legislation, but the idea that this is an attempt to break the unions, or that this is an assault upon working people, there are other working people who are suffering because of the strikes, and governments in the round have to consider their needs as well.
OK. Anna, I know you want to come. Just a couple more points. The man at the very back in the blue T-shirt.
So, fortunately, I would love to work in an industry where we had minimum service levels. Currently, the organisation I work for, there's a permanent court induction, which stops me from striking.
So what industry is that?
I'm a prison officer.
Right.
So currently, I don't have the right to strike. I should do. I'm a trade unionist. I'm not allowed to. If me and my colleagues talk about withdrawing our labour, we're contravening, and then we're in contempt of court.
And so do you think there are other sectors that should have the same injunctions that you have?
I think if it affects the prison service and affects the Prison Officers Association, it should affect everybody else. If not, it shouldn't affect us. So,
what, you mean all public sector workers shouldn't be allowed to strike?
No, it shouldn't affect us. Sorry, I'm not coming across clearly. It shouldn't affect anybody. Right. So everybody should have the right to strike. We can't have a two-tier system where certain people can, so the NHS, doctors, but prison officers and police officers can't.
And the man here in the front.
The issue I have with this problem is this is a reactive policy to the strikes that have been started off by the train workers that have got momentum through other public services, and I don't think it's appropriate for government to, instead of identifying a problem and finding a solution, to just legislate the problem away without recognising the problem and providing a solution for the people. I think it's quite telling that in the last couple of discussions, Alex won't recognise that the NHS is in crisis. We're now legislating against strikes to try and restrict that. And I think it's quite telling of kind of the approach the government has.
OK, Alex, I'll come back and let you answer that. So, Anna, what about Tim's point that there are other countries, I mean, France, Spain and Italy, for example? I mean, some of these minimum strike agreements are voluntary, but nonetheless there is legislation there.
As far as from what I can read, most of those countries don't enact this law in any event. But
they do have it, though.
Yeah, but this is I'm with Bridget on this. This is a complete distraction. The question that really we should all be debating is why we have a government that is absolutely incapable of settling these strikes, which it does have a role in, and sorting it out. And the answer is because we've got largely, Alex is probably one of the few exceptions, a bunch of incompetents, and we feel like we're being governed by teenagers, and it's about time we had the grown-ups back in charge.
I mean, Anna, it's hard to believe you ever were a Conservative listening to you.
Well, it's because the Conservative Party is barely the Conservative Party that I joined all those years ago.
Briefly,
and as I say, with the exception of Alec, it has been hijacked. It's now the Brexit Party. It's been hijacked by people who are ideologically driven on the right, and it's moved away from the centre ground, which is why it doesn't deserve to be in government come the next general election. It needs to be in opposition, it needs to regroup and go back to what it used to be, which was a centrist right party, but most importantly was a party that you could trust with the economy, which was competent, honest and decent. And we don't have those things in the Conservative Party anymore. Apart from you, Alex.
That was very kind of.
But can I just say, in a minority, lovely.
Anna, look, this is I backed Rishi Sunak, and I backed him because he said last summer that the greatest destroyer of all, not my words, by the way, Margaret Thatcher's words, was what? Inflation. The point that gentleman up there was made. We cannot deliver all we want for the British people. You know, what Winston Churchill, who talked about Conservatives, he called the treasure in the heart of every man, unless you get on top of inflation. And if we don't address this, if we don't do inflation, if we don't grow the economy, if we don't get on top of debt, then you will not have the great public service of the future. Final, very briefly, right, we're in Birmingham. There will be a child born today in this great city that in 25 years' time, through no fault of her own, will knock on the door of the state and say, do you know what, I need some support. I've been booted out of my house by an abusive boyfriend or whatever. It will be no answer to her to say, do you know what, the cupboard is bare because the last generation didn't get on top of inflation and didn't address these issues. So this Prime Minister will get on top of these issues and he will set...
Alex, you forget, and we have not forgotten, what Liz Truss and what your government did to our economy. It played a major part of the crisis we are in. And before that, we had Boris Johnson, who was undoubtedly the worst Prime Minister this country has ever had.
I'm going to move on.
And we will not forgive or forget.
Right, let me take... This is going to feel like a heck of a handbrake turn now, this next question. I've got to warn you, but there are a number of you asked about this, and it has a lot of people have talked about it. Listen, it is my job to reflect what the audience wants to talk about here. So come on then, Jake Aldridge, where are you? Jake.
Has Harry's autobiography damaged the monarchy?
Has Harry's autobiography damaged the monarchy? Well... It's been everywhere, hasn't it? I mean, let's face it, and he's been on all the airwaves. Tim?
I can't think of a subject where everyone says they don't want to hear any more about it, yet everyone wants to talk about it at the same time. No, I seriously don't believe it has damaged the monarchy because, for a start, we've heard all this before. I'm old enough to remember the 90s. Remember the Anna Soubry? There was a fire, there were several divorces.
No, but hang on, Tim. What is different about what Prince Harry is? Just to be serious.
Well, what is different about what he said?
Well, what I tentatively suggest is at the heart of what he's talking about. He's talking about a lot, let's face it. He's basically saying that the royal family conspired with the press to make him and Meghan look bad.
Right.
That's a very serious allegation that he is making.
Well, look, OK, as if that's never happened, as if no one's ever briefed. My point
it's just that he's saying that, and that is the first time we've heard it.
The question is the monarchy itself damaged? And my point is, you look back over its history, brothers have been at each other's throats, the media's been involved, we've had all this before, and it has survived. In a better age, Harry and William would have resolved this with pistols at dawn, but sadly now it's done through Netflix. But the monarchy survives because its strength, its significance does not rest on the individuals within it, but upon its constitutional role. It's its constitutional stability that it provides. That's why it has lasted despite having bad people within it. The person who I think with each revelation who comes out worse out of this, I'm afraid to say, is Harry himself. And the lesson that one takes from this is why so many of us appreciated Elizabeth II. And we might not have realised it at the time, but Elizabeth II never got on your nerves. Because she kept herself, she kept her opinions to herself.
That's setting the bar quite low.
No, it's not. It's not. Imagine, can you do that? And especially in the age of social media, to keep your opinions to yourself, to never put a foot wrong, to be always right and honourable and fair and even-handed. That woman was a remarkable demonstration of the power of silence and just getting on with it.
Okay. So, Ash, the question is, has Harry's autobiography and everything that's gone on this last week and a half damaged the monarchy? I mean, it's interesting what you say, Tim, about the monarchy survives because the monarchy itself is more important than an individual within it. And, of course, Harry's making the point that he's been the sacrificial lamb, in a way, for the institution.
Well, I think the people who come out worst from the autobiography are the press, quite frankly, because what the autobiography lifts a lid on is the very grubby dealings between the institution of the palace and the tabloid media, where instead of being able to be a family, which is defined by love and nurturing and caring for one another, the royals have been turned into this kind of hideous cartel where they're feeding each other to the wolves in order to advance their own interests. And I recognise this as a minority opinion in this country, but I do think that that is a quality inherent to monarchy. I think that princes and dukes are good names for musicians and dogs. I don't think that they're, great titles for human beings. And when you look at the misery that these people have inflicted on one another, I think of them as, like zoo animals who've been, bred in captivity, and they lead these existences where they're clearly really unhappy, but we go, oh, isn't it so good for tourism?
Ash, he never...
hang on a minute.
Ash,
OK.
In all seriousness, he never actually gives any examples of that whatsoever.
He does give examples. He gives the example of private conversations between, oh God, I can't believe I know this. I feel like I know too much about these people and it's driving me insane. But he gives examples of private conversations with Camilla and his brother, which made it to the press.
No, but he doesn't, you see.
He gives other examples of negative briefing against, him and Meghan. Now, I'm not taking sides because I'm a Republican. I've got integrity. I can't stand any of them. But I do think it lifts the lid on press practices. And one of the things you can tell about where power is truly wielded in this country is the fact that we were supposed to have Leveson Part 2, looking at press practices, how they collaborate with the police. And that got kicked into the long grass because no politician wants to get on the wrong side of Rupert Murdoch.
Let's hear a bit from our audience. Yes, the guys, you're waving your hand frantically there. Yes, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I've got a lot of respect for Elizabeth II as well. But what does it say about the purpose of the royal family if the best thing we're saying they should be doing is to be silent?
Because they fill a constitutional role. It's not about themselves as an individual.
All right, let me hear some. There's a man here at the front. We'll get a microphone to you in the striped shirt.
I think what we've got here is an example of hypocritical privilege. He's been happy to accept everything that comes with his role right the way through his life. He's criticised the media and said, I don't want anything to do with them. And now he's using them at his will to make money. I'm sorry, but that is just as low as it gets.
OK. Does anyone here want to put put in a good word for Harry? Does anyone here feel that actually what he's done is... There must be some here, yes. But done the right thing. Yes, the woman there actually, the woman on the end in the black, yeah.
I think Harry has done his best to address some personal struggles, and when I watched the interview with ITV, he sat down and he was quite candid. I think, what kind of country are we going to be if you can't even express freely, you know, how you feel, what you're going through? Now, what we have to also acknowledge is, yes, he may be making money, but he is doing things that he is enjoying. And I think one thing that I personally like to address as a black woman is that a lot of people negatively in the press have been blaming Meghan. We saw the very, very derogatory words by Clarkson, you know, Jeremy Clarkson, talking about how he wants to, I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm sure you're all familiar with it, talking about how he wants to see Meghan run through the streets and have, you know, basically poo thrown at her. And that, again, is an example of where, when we begin to blur the lines, we then see problems. I think what we have to also acknowledge is Harry is, even before Meghan came along, he felt disenfranchised, he felt left out. As Ash said, he gave the examples of where he felt like he was being fed to the dogs. And so I don't think it's fitting to say, you know, he's made his money, let's just, you know, he's ruining this and is the monarchy damaged. But there has to be a point, just with anything, whether it be strikes or whether it be any other political thing. As a politics student, there has to be, you know, what I've realised, there has to be an opportunity for people to say, this is what I believe, I'm going to air that. And so even, you know, things like racism, because racism is prevalent in the press and it needs to be addressed.
OK. Bridget?
I think it's terribly sad to see any family in conflict or where there's that kind of dispute, and I think it's even sadder when that's played out in public. You know, the royal family stay out of politics.
Is it damaging the monarchy? That's the thing.
No, I don't think it is. But the royal family stay out of politics, and I think it's right that politicians don't involve themselves in the private family matters of the royal family. I think it's terribly sad what's happened, but I don't think it's really for politicians to involve ourselves in any big way in that decision.
Is it damaging the monarchy?
No, it's not. And I think the only thing I would add, because Bridget's absolutely right, politicians don't get involved. The only thing, as we were talking about Queen Elizabeth II, I remember when she went to Ireland, that famous trip in 2011, and she was talking, of course, about reconciliation. And she gave this expression, which just occurred to me now, really resonated with me, where she said that if you want to reconcile, it's incumbent on everyone to think about how they might have done things differently or not at all. And it was a very, very powerful expression. And I just hope that relations do improve over time, because I think they've all made a contribution to their country. And families are difficult, of course they're difficult. But I think in the interests of that family, in the interests of the country, I do hope they reconcile.
I think it is, like Bridget said, I think it's really, really sad. And I was always a big fan of Prince Harry and indeed Meghan Markle. I thought it was a wonderful thing when they got married.
So when he says, so the criticisms he's made, for example, you know, you refer to the Queen Consort Camilla as dangerous due to her need to change her villain
No,
image.
I think he said she was seen as being dangerous.
Okay.
He never said she was.
With the family built on hierarchy and Camilla on the way to being Queen Consort, there was going to be people or bodies left in the street because of that. I mean, do you think this stuff is damaging? That's what
I think it's damaging to Harry.
Right.
I don't think it will damage the monarchy for the reasons that Tim and others have said. But I think a lot of what he said would have been better left between him and his psychotherapist, frankly. And not, I mean, I really don't want to know, no disrespect, I don't want to know about how anybody lost their virginity. Never mind
we're going to talk about that afterwards.
That was going to be the topic of conversation in the green room, was it?
That would be between you and I. But I mean, in all seriousness, look, what happened to him, like any 12-year-old, to lose your mother, but particularly in those circumstances, was appalling. And I'm sure that lots of terrible mistakes were made. But I think one of my criticisms of this is that he doesn't actually have any solutions to it at all. He doesn't have anything positive to say, look, this is how perhaps we could do things better.
And in fact, perversely, he wants to come back. So,
he also said he doesn't think there is any way back.
He called the family hierarchical. It's a monarchy.
Okay.
Hello? Of course it's hierarchical. Right. And this is the strange thing about Harry. He attacks the individuals within the institution, but when asked, do you still support the monarchy? I do. And now, from the point of view of a Republican, isn't that a little bit mad?
Well, I think he should give up his titles, and that's the thing which leaves me very cold, is that I think that Meghan and Harry have been treated abominably by the institution. I think they've been treated abominably by the press. But please spare me the words from a duke and a Duchess about equality when their complaint is that
All
they've not been treated well by an inherently unequal institution.
Let's not spend any longer talking about that subject, simply because so much has been said about it the last week and a half. Well, no, but he's made... Listen. The airways have been full of it, so it's not that people haven't wanted to talk about it, and you want to talk about it in your audience. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. I just want to get this question in from Anna. Anna, perfect. Where are you? There you go. Anna.
Students currently study maths to 16. Rishi Sunak wants to increase this to 18. What difference will 4 years make?
I have to say, when I saw that question coming out, I laughed like a drain. Very nicely and ironically put. And you're a teacher, I think, Anna, is that right? Yes, so obviously the joke is there. OK. Study maths to 18. Alex, what, everyone done the idea is for everyone to do A-level, or...?
No, absolutely not.
What is it, then?
No, of course it's not for everyone to do A-level. And that, no, what the Prime Minister is saying, and he's absolutely right, is that as you compare... No, he is. Look, he's absolutely right. If you compare...
We can have to be quite brief, actually. We've got 3 minutes left.
So okay, fine. But if you compare this country to peer nations, typically they do tend to do maths till later. Now, of course, not everyone is going to do A-level. That's right. But when it comes to financial education, so that people can be more empowered when they're dealing with issues of credit or mortgages or rent or compounding, these sorts of principles are things that are going to assist our young people. Final point, of course, we are in a global competition. We're in a global competition with nations like India, like China. Over half of the world's economy is now in the Eastern Hemisphere. We've got to ensure that this country is match fit to win the jobs of tomorrow, and maths is important to that.
We'll have to be quite brief, Bridget, forgive me.
It's a meaningless pledge from the Prime Minister. We don't have enough maths teachers already to teach the children that we currently have, and year-on-year recruitment targets are met for our maths teachers, and some of the same challenges that we see in our NHS, we see in our schools. I think it is really important that children get a strong foundation in all of the basics, and I believe in high standards in all of our schools. That's why we've said that Labour would end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, and we would put that £1.7 billion into brilliant state education for every child in our country.
We have to be very quick. Tim.
Labour has said it might ban smoking, and the Tories want us to do double maths. I don't know who I'm supposed to vote for at the next election. If I was forced to do maths, I would have dropped out of school rather than do it. I hate it. I was terrible at it. And if anyone can't count by the age of 16, why on earth do you imagine that forcing them to do 2 more years of it at a higher level is going to make them any better at it? It's so stupid.
I'm really getting worried because I agree with Tim yet again, but I would say this. I think for your first speech to the nation, to say that your big vision for the future of our country is that we should all be doing maths in 4 years' time until we're 18 says a lot about the state of this government. It doesn't have a vision, and we need now to have a leader of our country who is competent, decent, but also has a vision for our future.
He doesn't have a vision at all. He doesn't have a vision at all. He's got no plan.
I'm so sorry, but I have got to let Ash.
I mean, like, talking about counting, of those 5 pledges, I think 2 or 3 of them were going to happen anyway, so that is cheating.
Yes, that's true.
When it comes to maths lessons, when it comes to maths lessons, I actually don't think it's a bad idea. And first and foremost, I think that those maths lessons should be given to...
Are you agreeing with the government now?
I don't think it's a bad idea. I think maybe I'd have, retained a bit of long division had I done it to 18 rather than dropping it at 16. But I think that first in line for those maths lessons should be the MPs of your own party who crashed the economy into the wall in order to give tax cuts to the rich.
Let's give it last. We've got about 20 seconds, Anna. Let's hear from you.
I was about to say the same thing. I agree with Bridget. There's not enough maths teachers as there is, but perhaps Chancellor Kwarteng and Prime Minister Truss could have done with a calculator in the summer, and that might have avoided some of the other issues.
Okay. Right. Well, if we can count, our 60 minutes are up. Thank you very much to the panel for coming on the scene for our first programme of 2023. Thank you to all of you for coming here and being part of this programme and contributing to such a lively debate. And, of course, thank you to you at home for watching. Don't forget, next week, Hodston, we're talking about the NHS healthcare. If you want to be part of that audience, we would love you to be there. Until next week, from Question Time in Birmingham. Bye-bye.